What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the SFS channel. My name's Gavin, and today I've got my second half of the positional rankings video. Yesterday I did my quarterbacks and wide receivers for you guys, and today I've got my running backs and tight ends. If you guys have been enjoying my content here so far on the SFS channel or are brand new here, make sure to go like this video and subscribe to the channel and turn that bell on so you guys are notified whenever I come out with a new episode. I really enjoy helping you guys out and look forward to guiding you to strong finishes in the 2020 fantasy season. And remember, if I get to my 1,000 subscriber goal by the start of the new year, I'll be giving away 10 draft guides completely free to my subscribers just for the support and continued success and growth we've had here on the channel recently. So thank you guys so much for that. Let's hit the intro and let's get into the rankings. Alright, we're going to start this video out with the running backs today. And my number 24 running back this week, so the bottom of the list for my RB2s, is Jerrick McKinnon, who has had two very disappointing fantasy games in a row. Jerrick McKinnon has been suffering from what he has described as tired legs. I think that just since he hasn't played in 2 years, I think the NFL game is starting to catch up with him, and he's just a little bit worn down. But there's something you guys need to know about me. I am a Green Bay Packers fan, so if you are new to the channel here, that is something important for you guys to know. And I'm not your typical NFL fan. I try and look at things from a realistic stance. I try to keep the emotion and bias out of my takes, especially in fantasy when regarding the Packers. And when looking at Green Bay this year, we do some things really well, but we really suck at other things. The first thing that comes to mind when I think about deficiencies in the 2020 Green Bay Packers is that run defense couldn't stop a nosebleed. Those guys stink at defending the run and stopping those guys. No one's plugging up holes this year for the Packers front, and people have run wild on us this year. You guys saw what Dalvin Cook did last week. He's the first player in NFL history to score on a team's first 4 drives. That is ridiculous, and it happened against my Packers. So when looking at this from a realistic standpoint, Jerrick McKinnon is a guy who has really struggled the last couple weeks, and I don't think he's actually going to get the lead carries in that backfield. I think he's actually going to be out-touched by someone else I'll talk about later on in this video. But Jerrick McKinnon has a great matchup this week. Raheem Mostert in the NFC Championship game against Green Bay had over 200 yards and 4 touchdowns against the Packers. I don't think that either of the backs that I see as fantasy relevant this week do that for the 49ers, but I think collectively they have over 200 scrimmage yards and maybe even 3 touchdowns between the pair. Jerrick McKinnon definitely comes with his risks this week, but the matchup I think outweighs that. There's a reason he's so low on my RB rankings this week, but he's still an RB2 for me. I'm giving him a risky start this week in a couple leagues. I think that it's worth it against the league worst Green Bay Packers run stop. My next guy up on the list, my RB23 for this week, is Leonard Fournette, the Buccaneers. What now looks to be their lead back. Unfortunately, this makes me really sad, but Ronald Jones, I thought, earned that backfield. I think he earned the carries for that team. But Leonard Fournette came back from his injury, and he has seemingly taken over that offense. He's been getting the majority of the carries since he returned from injury. And Leonard Fournette this week, though, despite having that lead work in his back pocket, has the Saints defense this week, who has been very stout against the run. I've been saying this for weeks and weeks. Just about every week, the player starting against the Saints at running back for the other team is on my sit list or a fade for me for that week. And Leonard Fournette is no different this week. I've probably brought up this stat a million times, but the Saints haven't allowed a 100-yard rusher in like 3 years. It's a crazy number of games. David Montgomery actually looked like he was going to snap that streak last week because he had like 2 carries of 20-plus yards, but he didn't, and they went to overtime. So that just tells you how good that Saints run stop is. Leonard Fournette needs touchdowns to be relevant this week. I think he's going to struggle to pick up yardage on the ground, and he's going to depend on receptions and goal line carries this week. So Leonard Fournette, still a guy in deeper leagues and especially standard leagues I'm giving consideration to, but not a guy I'm excited about starting this week. Going into the 2020 fantasy football draft season, Jonathan Taylor was one of my favorite backs to target at his ADP price, but especially after last week's game and honestly the lack of explosive production he's had this season, I'm starting to have my questions about Jonathan Taylor. He was seemingly benched mid-game for Jordan Wilkins after a really slow start against Detroit, and he popped up on the injury list this week for Indianapolis. But Jonathan Taylor is going to have to prove to fantasy owners that he deserves to be put in your starting lineups again. Against Baltimore this week, a very solid front seven. I think he's not necessarily going to have easy yards at his hands. So Jonathan Taylor has a big prove-it game this week. I think he has the opportunity to turn a lot of heads and show that he is a fantasy relevant back still and a very high level producer, but he's got his work cut out for him. Like I said, Jonathan Taylor has a big test in front of him, and if he can produce against the Ravens, I'll feel a lot more comfortable about him going forward. But right now, he's a guy I'm a little bit more questionable about, so he's lower on my list this week. At RB21 this week, Damien Harris gets a little bit of a bump over Jonathan Taylor simply because of matchup. I think Damien Harris is very limited in the receiving aspect of the fantasy game. The Pats don't really want to throw him the football. They're more looking to get the ball out to Rex Burkhead and James White in that aspect of the game. But Damien Harris is their ground and pound guy. He's overtaken Sony Michel for that work, and he is the guy you want to own in the Pats backfield this season. He's maybe even a touch higher for me in these rankings if I were to do this based on standard league projections, but I do this based off of my feelings on players in regards to half PPR scoring. I don't want to sway things one way or the other, but Damien Harris is a very good play in standard leagues this week. I think that he's going to have the opportunity to get a couple scores on the ground if the Panthers are to get down to the 1 yard line, but obviously Cam Newton is a threat to steal his work there. I think Damien Harris is in for some nice volume this week. If he can convert those carries into positive yardage, he's in for a very nice day, and he's a solid RB2 for me in Week 9. At RB20 for me this week, Devin Singletary is a guy who I've been hating on all season. I have not been a fan of Bills running backs the entire way, but this week, Devin Singletary has a matchup I'm really excited about. I think Josh Allen and that Bills offense are going to do big things against Seattle, and I think Devin Singletary plays perfectly into that game plan. Devin Singletary excels at receptions and in the receiving game, so I think he's in for a big workload this week. I could see Singletary racking up between 6 and 10 catches even out of the backfield. I think the Seahawks are going to be so concerned about stopping Stephon Diggs over the top that they're going to let the underneath routes have an extreme amount of cushion, and so guys like Cole Beasley, Devin Singletary, and other intermediate pass catchers are going to have really nice games as well. I think the Bills' offense is going to click this week, and Devin Singletary is a guy who, especially in PPR leagues, you're looking at starting this week. I really do not like this guy anymore in fantasy this season. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a guy who is really only on this list at this point for his talent. I don't like his fantasy situation and that Chiefs offense at all anymore. I don't like the volume he gets specifically. And with Le'Veon Bell there, he just ruined his fantasy value. So Clyde is simply on here because he's a guy who's dynamic and can make big burst plays happen. I think CEH has potential to score a touchdown, to be very effective in the receiving game, but last week Clyde had 8 carries, I think. That's just not going to get it done, especially in an offense where they're just not interested in running the football. Really no one gets handoffs in that offense, and you see guys on third down not getting the carries. Pat Mahomes is sneaking the ball. They just want to keep the football in arguably the league's best player's hand, and you can't really blame them for that. I mean, Clyde is very talented in his own right, but Pat Mahomes can do a lot more things with the football than Clyde can. I mean, he can zing it 75 yards down the field to Tyreek Hill for an instant score. So, CEH, more of a talent play, a guy you're just hoping has an explosive carry or catch. He's going to need an explosive play this week to be fantasy relevant and to put up numbers, especially in standard leagues. So, Clyde, not a guy I'm excited about the rest of the season. Please sell him if he's on your roster because you really don't want him the rest of the way. And he's a guy I think is a lower-end RB2 this week. Based off my personal projections, I think DeAndre Swift has the potential to move very high up this list in the coming weeks, but after last week's performance against the Colts, I think that it's realistic to pull back expectations a little bit and to be a little bit more cautious with him this week. I think against Minnesota, he's got a really great opportunity to prove that he can put up numbers for your fantasy lineups. He had 2 great games in a row where I was thinking, DeAndre Swift in PPR leagues is a must-start RB2, but then last week happened. Obviously, the Colts are a very sound defensive team, though, so it has to be taken with a grain of salt. You got to take that game and look forward with some optimism, but you also have to have some skepticism as well. You have to be optimistic that DeAndre Swift is good with the ball in his hands. We know that. We know he can produce when he gets the opportunities, but he just didn't find that space last week, and it was concerning. And then you have to be a little bit skeptical about the volume he received last week and the touches he saw in the end of the game. I think he only had 9 total touches, 6 rushing for 1 yard, and 3 receiving for probably, 20 yards. So DeAndre Swift, a guy who can flip me back in his favor if he has a nice week against Minnesota in Week 9. But I think I'm going into this game with him ranked as my RB 18 with a little bit of caution. He definitely can put up better numbers than that. but I think just being realistic, he needs to stay back in my rankings just a little bit this week. Last point on DeAndre Swift before I talk about Montgomery here. Swift is definitely a guy who has some more upside than these next couple players, David Montgomery included. These are guys who are going to get their volume, and you know that they're going to produce a nice floor for you. But DeAndre Swift just has a bit of a shaky floor right now and some tremendous upside. So that's why he's back a little bit in the rankings. But David Montgomery here gets the step over him this week because Tennessee's defense just hasn't been that solid this year. The Titans' offense has undoubtedly been the strength of that team, even though they went out and added Clowney in free agency and they just traded for Desmond King. I think that group is going to get a little bit better, but they haven't taken that leap that we expected. They've been kind of weak on the outside perimeter of their secondary. Those corners have been getting beat deep badly. So David Montgomery, he's going to get his looks. The Bears are not a great run-blocking team. I think he's got a nice opportunity against Tennessee this week, though. I'd expect between 15 and 20 touches for Montgomery this week, and a very closely contested football game will allow Montgomery to get those looks. Before heading into the bye week, in Week 8, Antonio Gibson was fantastic in his last performance against the Cowboys in Week 7. He had clearly his best game as an NFL player and only his rookie season, and Antonio Gibson looks like a guy who's very dynamic and versatile and will be used heavily in that Washington football team offense going forward. I really like Gibson as a runner and a receiver in that offense, but this week he's got a somewhat stingy matchup against the Giants. New York hasn't been an absolute shutdown in the middle like they sort of were last season with Leonard Williams. They were very solid up front down the stretch after the trade deadline, but I think they're a little bit more susceptible to being taken by the run game this year, and Antonio Gibson is a guy who can get it done. I like Gibson this week as a high-level RB2 with some nice upside. I think if Antonio Gibson gets involved highly in the receiving game, he can put up some really nice totals, and I think that if he scores as well, he's going to have a very nice outing. Ultimately, I think that his production this week is going to come down to how the game plays out for both of these teams. If this is a close game, I think Gibson's going to be able to be highly involved and touch the football a lot. But if one team jumps out to a significant lead, I think things get a little bit mushy for him. Gibson, though, is a running back I'm very high on this week, and I would look to start him in all PPR formats. At running back 15 for me this week, Melvin Gordon is a guy I've got my questions about, but a favorable matchup against the Falcons defense gives him a bit of a bump in my rankings this week. I think Gordon is still pretty versatile at this stage in his career, and as a guy who's not quite the same player that we once saw with the Chargers, he is still capable of putting up really productive fantasy numbers. And like I said, Atlanta, not great at stopping the run. They're not terrible at it, but they are not excelling in the run-stop game. I think Melvin Gordon's got a nice opportunity on the ground this week and could punch a couple in on the goal line as well. So for that reason, Melvin Gordon is a top-level running back 2 for me this week. I'd look to start him, but he's definitely a guy who the rest of the season I have my questions about. During the early days of the SFS channel, and specifically during my mock draft season over the summer here, Justin Jackson was a guy I talked about as being one of the most valuable handcuff players in fantasy for this season. And that was due to the fact that he has produced in his career as the backup to Melvin Gordon and Austin Eckler before in his career. We've seen Justin Jackson come on the field and produce, and he's been very effective when he's had the opportunity to do so this season. I really wish, honestly, that the Chargers did not draft Joshua Kelly. I think he's a nice hammer for that team, but he takes away touches from Justin Jackson, who I think is a far more dynamic and explosive runner. I really like what Justin Jackson has to offer for this team, and I think he provides some really nice value in fantasy lineups. The thing that really sucks about the Chargers having Josh Kelly is he takes away Justin Jackson's goal line value because he is that hammer running back that they want to use down there in the red zone. But Justin Jackson still has a value in fantasy lineups this week. And against the Las Vegas Raiders, I think he has a really nice matchup this week. So Justin Jackson, another high-level RB2 for me this week. He's had some really nice games in the receiving aspect the last couple weeks, and he's been very efficient on the ground as well. Justin Jackson, if he can break one away, might even creep into low-end RB1 territory for the week. But for Week 9, I think for me, he is definitely a solid, reliable starter. The talent is there for me this week for Ezekiel Elliott, but the matchup is not. The Pittsburgh Steelers are the last team the Cowboys want to see on the other side of the ball. That defense is scary. They just picked up Avery Williamson at the trade deadline to bolster that inside linebacking group that was decimated by the Devin Bush ACL injury, and they are so good up front. Between Stephon Tuitt, Cam Hayward, TJ Watt, Bud Dupree, that front seven is nasty. And like I said, adding Avery Williamson is going to help as well. He is a tackling machine, and Ezekiel Elliott just doesn't have anywhere to run against this team. His line is not going to be able to block for him, especially against this team, the Steelers. So I think Zeke's going to struggle this week. He's going to get his volume. The Cowboys are going to try and use Zeke to carry them through this game, but ultimately Pittsburgh is so good at defending the run that I think he's just going to be shut down. He's only my RB13 this week for that reason. I think that to provide value, Zeke needs some touchdowns this week. And honestly, I only gave him this high on the rankings list because of that talent and that pedigree that he's had the last few years and during his NFL career. But Zeke this week has a brutal matchup. I think he has the potential for a 3 or 4 point just fancy disaster. Like I said, he's going to need some touchdowns or some real nice receiving value to be relevant this week. I think Zeke has a very tough situation in Week 9. Moving into the RB1 type tier players for this week, JaMycal Hasty starts off the branch of lower end RB1s for Week 9. JaMycal Hasty, he's got the Packers tonight on Thursday Night Football as I'm recording this video. And as I already mentioned, I totally trashed my Packers run stop earlier in this episode with my first guy up on the list, Jerrick McKinnon. JaMycal Hasty, I think, is going to be the lead back against Green Bay tonight. I think he's going to have his way with that run stop, and I think he's going to be really productive. I could see JaMycal Hasty having over 100 scrimmage yards tonight and a score or two, so definitely look for him to break off an explosive touchdown here or there. I think he's definitely a guy who's going to produce very nice numbers for your lineups this week as a stream option, so that's a very nice value as well. In half PPR scoring this year, Todd Gurley is the RB6, but I've got him significantly back this week, 5 spots into my RB11 role. Todd Gurley, I've been saying this for a long time. You guys should have sold on him while you had the chance. This week starts off his brutal end-of-the-season schedule, and the Broncos are one of the best units against the run in the NFL. I don't like Todd Gurley this week. I think he's going to have minimal rushing yards and needs those rushing touchdowns this week to be relevant. Last week he got in the end zone against Carolina, but I thought he looked pretty shaky in that game too. He missed almost an entire quarter for whatever reason. I don't know if they were resting his knee or what was going on there, but Todd Gurley, a guy who's definitely trending down the rest of the season. I hope you guys were able to sell him off your teams. Josh Jacobs, another guy I'm not high on the rest of the way this year. He's got the rushing volume. He's going to get his carries, but he just doesn't get that receiving volume, and he's just not involved in the Raiders' passing game. He doesn't get screen passes. He rarely gets checkdowns from Derek Carr. There's just other guys they look to in that offense like Darren Waller and whatnot. So Josh Jacobs in a standard league format is definitely a reliable starter and a safe option because all you need is those yards. But in leagues where those receptions have somewhat of a value, where you get half a point, 1 point, or 2 points, Josh Jacobs is significantly lacking in that area of the game, and he's not a guy I'm super excited about this week either. He's my RB10, and he's going to get a lot of carries against LA, but I think he's going to be limited in his upside this week. Jacobs is a safe floor player, but he's got a low ceiling the rest of the year. The main difference for me between Josh Jacobs and a guy like David Johnson this week is the fact that David Johnson actually gets thrown the football by Deshaun Watson, and they actually set up plays for him in the receiving game. David Johnson is definitely not in the prime of his career anymore. He's on the back end. He's not as good as he once was, but he is still a very solid fantasy option, and the Texans use him the right way for the most part. I know a lot of Texans fans actually think that he should be used even more, and they're underusing him, but I think it's fair the amount of usage David Johnson gets at age nearly 29 here, as you can see on the screen. David Johnson's a guy who the rest of the season I see putting up low-end RB1 numbers or high-end RB2 numbers at the worst. I think he's going to be very productive. If you're an RB-needy team, David Johnson is a very safe play at your RB2 position that you can put him in, and he's going to produce for your lineups and not necessarily have a meltdown week. So David Johnson, I like him this week. I think he's going to be pretty good going forward. Still not quite sure if Chris Carson is going to suit up against the Buffalo Bills on Sunday, but if he does, Chris Carson, a guy I really like against the Bills and in general this fantasy season. I think he actually exceeded my expectations for him this year. He's the guy with the most 20-plus touch games in the last 2 NFL seasons. I think that streak might come to an end relatively soon here because he's missed some time, but Chris Carson, very solid producer. He can catch the football, and he gets lots of carries as well. He's very efficient in that Seattle offense, and they love giving him the ball. So this week, a little bit lower than usual because Buffalo is a very solid unit against the run, but Chris Carson still warrants RB1 territory this week. James Conner is my RB7 in my rankings list this week, but it's definitely within the realm of possibility that he goes off against Dallas this week. If Pittsburgh gets a big lead early, they just run out the clock, and James Conner has his way with that team. I think that he's definitely a guy who has a super high ceiling against Dallas this week, and he's also a guy who has a very safe floor. My biggest concern about James Conner coming into this year was he going to be able to stay healthy, and he's done so far, knock on wood there, but James Conner has been super good. He's getting that volume you look for out of an RB1. He's getting that production in the running and receiving game. I love his matchup against Dallas this week, and I think that James Conner is in for a big-time performance. At RB6 this week, I am super excited to see Chase Edmonds get his first start of the season. I think that he could honestly take this backfield over and take it by storm. Chase Edmonds is so dynamic. He's so efficient. He has been great when given the opportunity in the Cardinals offense. I really wish they would just pull the plug on Kenyon Drake and just go to Chase Edmonds. This guy is so much better for fantasy. He produces on the field, and Kenyon Drake's guy who's getting like 3 yards per carry. Chase Edmonds is out here just exploding and getting huge burst plays. He can do it split out wide or in the backfield. He is very versatile, and he's a guy I cannot wait to see get the workload this week. Super high ceiling against Miami, a really nice floor as well because of all that receiving volume he gets. I love Chase Edmonds in Week 9. Derrick Henry is my RB5 this week. Obviously, he's going to get his work against Chicago. It's a tough defense, but Derrick Henry produces regardless. He's going to get 20-plus carries. He's going to move the football down the field. You just can't completely stop a guy this massive and skilled at running the football down. He's going to get his work. He's going to produce for your teams. Chicago's been solid against the run, but they haven't been all-out run stuffers. I still think Derrick Henry gets his way, like I said, with this unit. And for a guy who is the entire core of that Titans offense, he's going to be involved. I can see him get in the end zone a couple times this week. I think Derrick Henry's got a very safe floor and a very favorable ceiling as always. James Robinson is my RB4 this week, and there's some concern here. He doesn't have a true starting quarterback this week. Gardner Minshew has a fractured hand, so he's not going to be playing this week. And there's the argument that it might be somewhat easy for the Texans to just stack the box and take away James Robinson from their rookie quarterback in his first start. But James Robinson, I think, has the opportunity to show that he is truly here to stay in the NFL. He's an undrafted rookie, and he has been excellent in his first season here as the starter and really the bell cow for that Jags offense. The Jags really go as James Robinson does this year, and if he's not producing, they're not producing. I think he's got the opportunity to take this game over, be highly involved in the rushing and receiving games, and have a massive fantasy week. So he carries some risk this week, a little bit of a lower floor than normal. Houston posted the worst outing for James Robinson yet this season. I think that could happen again, but there's also a scenario where James Robinson goes nuts and completely carries that team to a win. I had a hard time putting Alvin Kamara so high on the list this week because of how good Tampa Bay is against the run. But Alvin Kamara is so much more than a running back. He is an elite wide receiver on that team as well. I mean, you could split him out wide and put him in the Michael Thomas role, and the guy would put up elite numbers. Alvin Kamara is the most talented and versatile weapon in football. The guy can do it all. 12 carries, 16 yards against Tampa Bay in Week 1, but he had a rushing touchdown, and he got it done through the air as well, and another touchdown there. So even if Alvin Kamara can't run the football this week, they're going to get him involved somehow. He's going to have that receiving value in his game. It's not going away. Alvin Kamara is, as always, a dependable RB1 and an elite one at that. Welcome back, CMC. It's been a long time since we've seen the RB1 from last year in the NFL. He's been out for the majority of this season with an ankle injury, and I am excited to see him back in action. I think he's going to be the feature player for Carolina this week. I think they're going to use him to try and eat up a ton of that clock against Kansas City and keep Pat Mahomes on the sideline. I think that also when the Panthers are in third down and long situations, when they have to throw the ball, CMC is a big upgrade over Mike Davis in the passing game and a guy who can really pick those up in the flats. You can throw him a little 2-yard ball and he can do the rest himself. So CMC, he's going to pick up right where he left off. He's my RB2 this week and a high-level starter in fantasy. And then for the second straight week, Dalvin Cook is my RB1 for fantasy football. Obviously, last week, he demolished my Packers. 4 touchdowns on the Vikings' first 4 possessions. It was an absolute nightmare for Green Bay. And he just ate our run defense alive, to be honest. He had holes left and right. He had a receiving touchdown as well on a screen pass. I believe he had roughly 50 points in half PPR scoring it was ridiculous. Dalvin Cook had a monster game. Definitely a guy you're hoping you're not playing this week if you are on the other side of this matchup. But if you're owning Dalvin Cook, you're sitting pretty good this week. I think he can probably take over your matchup by himself and win it for you. So Dalvin Cook, a player you need to either not be playing or have on your teams, because anything in between is going to be a disaster. If you're going up against this guy, good luck, because you're in for a long week. Into my tight end section now. We're going to kind of cruise through these guys. Only my top 12 for the tight end position, and we're going to start off with Johnu Smith. Obviously, Smith got off to a white-hot start. He was looking like the runaway tight end one this season, but he has been really, really quiet the last few weeks. Johnu Smith gets one more chance for me this week as my tight end 12. If he doesn't produce, I'm dropping him in leagues, and I'm going to start bailing on him. He's a guy I'm really concerned about, and he's got a somewhat decent matchup against Chicago. They're not super good against the tight end or super bad, so Johnu Smith, he's got the opportunity to produce. He just has to show he can still get it done. Hayden Hurst was a really good sleeper pick at tight end this year. He's got a bit of a difficult matchup against Denver this week, though. Vic Fangio, a very good D coordinator and defensive head coach. I think Hayden Hurst has somewhat decent numbers. I think he's still going to get some looks and some passes, but don't expect a high ceiling from him in Week 9. Evan Engram is my tight end 10 for Week 9. He has been a guy who I think has actually missed on his draft value this year. I think for the price you guys paid to get Evan Engram on your teams, he has not really been as elite or standout as you guys were hoping for. Despite being somewhat disappointing, though, I know Evan Engram is still one of the top targets in that Giants offense. He's one of the best weapons they have. We are obviously hoping to get top 3 production out of Evan Engram this year if you drafted him, but he is still a fantasy viable player. He's a guy I'm looking to start this week. He's got a bit of a difficult matchup against Washington, but I think he will still get his looks just like some of these other guys on the list. So Evan Engram, definitely a must-start tight end this week. He's better than all the streaming options for Week 9. Just one spot above Evan Engram at tight end 9 is Hunter Henry this week, and he's just a red zone monster. Hunter Henry gets a lot of touchdowns for Justin Herbert. Those guys have a connection in the red zone just like Henry and Phillip Rivers did. I think Hunter Henry has a great chance to score a touchdown this week. The Raiders don't excel at covering the tight end, and Hunter Henry is just a really reliable target. He's not the most athletic guy, but he knows how to read a defense and sit down in the open zone. He will get some looks this week and have a very safe floor. This is simply a matchup thing for me, and as I look at my notes here, I realize I skipped a number, and I only ranked my top 11 tight ends. I actually skipped over number 8. So my tight end 7 this week is Eric Ebron. You can bump everyone else up a marker this week. Eric Ebron's got a great matchup against Dallas this week. I think that there's a lot of mouths to feed in that Steelers offense, so you're just kind of hoping Ebron gets a big catch or a big score and is able to be the guy who finds himself wide open in that coverage. Eric Ebron, I think, has a nice ceiling this week, but like I said, a lot of mouths to feed in Pittsburgh, so I think he might have the potential for a bit of a shaky floor. I still like him this week, though, against Dallas. I think he has the opportunity to put up some really nice fantasy numbers. Normally for me, Mark Andrews is a perennial top 3 tight end, especially with George Kittle not being in play the rest of the fantasy season. But this week, tight end 6, simply a product of this difficult matchup. Darius Leonard and those Colts linebackers are excellent at covering the pass and playing elite zone coverage on tight ends. They are the number 1 ranked team at defending the tight end this season. So Mark Andrews, who has a very difficult matchup, in an offense that is not super pass happy. Lamar Jackson wants to run the ball and run option. He's a red zone threat. He needs a touchdown this week to produce. And I think Mark Andrews might have yet again another quiet week, but that sets him up for an even nicer buy low candidate option in Week 10. Noah Fant is my tight end 5 against the Falcons this week. Obviously, Atlanta, we've been talking about this all season long. Bad secondary. It shored up a little bit last week, but Noah Fant is an elite athlete and elite talent for that team. And as Denver Broncos pass catchers and offensive weapons continue to drop like flies, the options become more and more limited for Drew Lock, and Noah Fant is one of his go-to guys, so I like him in Week 9. TJ Hockenson was a guy I considered moving down my list after the Matthew Stafford news came out about being placed on the COVID reserve list, but after I thought about it a little bit, I thought TJ Hockenson still is a safe option this week. Regardless of who suits up at quarterback for the Lions, whether it's David Blau or Chase Daniels, he has some rapport with David Blau after last season, playing nearly half the year with him. And then Chase Daniel is a veteran quarterback who will get the ball to him efficiently as well. And overall, I think a wide receiver takes more of a hit than a tight end does in terms of the value that you see out of them in fantasy when a quarterback change is made. Tight ends are closer to the line of scrimmage and not running crazy down the field routes, so they're more of a safe option and a reliable target for those QBs. I like TJ Hockenson this week against the Vikings, struggling secondary and defensive unit. Obviously, they won against the Green Bay Packers last week, but they still scored at will. And Robert Tonyan, who you see absent from the list this week, has a very difficult matchup against San Fran this week, but he produced against Minnesota last week as well, so I like TJ Hockenson in Week 9. Big Rob Gronkowski is my tight end 3 for Week 9 action. Gronk, I think, is just going to have a huge day against New Orleans. They don't cover the tight end very well. Last week, I thought Jimmy G for the Bears was going to have a big game, but he did not. He was unable to get the football because he was not on the same page with Nick Foles throughout that game. But Rob Gronkowski and Tom Brady is definitely not a concern for being on the same page. Those guys have played together for numerous years and are definitely one of the best QB to tight end combinations of all time. I think we might be in store for another consecutive week of a Gronk spike this week. Rob Gronkowski, over the past few games, has definitely asserted himself back into must-start tight end territory. And despite Antonio Brown joining the lineup, I think Gronk is one of the guys who stays as a productive pass catcher for the Bucs. My tight end 2 this week is Darren Waller against the Los Angeles Chargers. The Chargers has traded away Desmond King, who might have played a role in covering Waller this week, so I really like Darren Waller's value this week. Obviously, a must-start top 3 tight end the entire rest of the season prior to this week, but a matchup I like this week, Darren Waller is a must-go-to tight end this week. Hope you're not playing against him in fantasy in Week 9. And then this is pretty much a weekly deal at this point. The tight end 1 for me almost every week is going to be Travis Kelce. Him and Pat Mahomes are just too good together to put lower on the list than number 1. I think Darren Waller is really the only guy that makes a run at taking this position from him the rest of the season if he's got a nice matchup. So Travis Kelce, expect to see him frequently in the number 1 spot at tight end this year. I think it's going to be a common sight for you guys. With that being said, those were my positional rankings for the running back and tight end groups in Week 9 fantasy football action. Before you guys head out of here, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it, and I'd love to have you guys stick around here on the channel with me. So with that being said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.